Sorry, I have to take a quick break. Back to the video.
Because of clickbait culture. What happens is that headlines typically fall into one of two categories. It's either, we just found out that everything we know about physics is wrong, or, we just found out that there definitely are parallel universes and we can probably go there. The first variety is always a complete lie, and for people who read the headline but not the story to get some context, which is almost everyone quite frankly, it produces the sentiment that science is hopelessly uncertain, being constantly torn down and rebuilt anew, therefore it can never be trusted. This is very dangerous. And the second variety is also a lie, or at least a misrepresentation of experimental results. It as serious or rampant a problem as the baseless distrust, but is still illusory. Sensationalist reporting of science news, no matter which way it leans, is destroying public perception of science. But the blame is with the media outlets, not with the scientists.
For example, carbohydrates, which is the main class of compounds. These are the units that hook together DNA. These are the units that have identifying aspects on cell structure. These are the units that the cell is going to need for the energy of life. Carbohydrates are kinetic products, meaning that if they should form, they would decompose. They decompose over time. In relatively short amounts of time, they decompose. The very reactions that make them, unless somebody is there to pull them out, to fish them out, to stop the process and to put them in a bottle under inert conditions in a freezer. And not just one, there's many different types you have to do this. They end up going through a process of what's referred to as caramelization, meaning that they polymerize. They polymerize. The very aldol reactions that were used to make them just continue. And you get polyaldols, you get polycondensation reactions, and they caramelize. Or they undergo, with formaldehyde, which is a presumed prebiotic chemical, they undergo rapid Canizarro reactions. So the aldehyde is oxidized to formic acid, and this nice carbohydrate that you made has just been reduced. So the aldehyde from the carbohydrate has gone back to an alcohol. So there's competing reactions. So time does not solve the issue.
So this is an abbreviated example of one of Jim's favorite talking points, which is that long spans of time make abiogenesis less likely rather than more likely because biomolecules have a tendency to degrade. But there are some problems here. First, he is presuming that nature might synthesize one component of life one time and that's it. There's no reason to believe this. If conditions are allowing for some molecule to form or polymerize, then it can be doing that all the time. It polymerizes, then degrades, then polymerizes again. Whatever biochemical process the molecule will later be involved in, the fact that it degrades is irrelevant if it is constantly being formed as well, and even more irrelevant once self-replication came about, such that a mechanism is in place to continually build copies given the raw components. He also refers to a specific reaction called the Canizarro reaction, which requires strongly basic conditions. He knows these conditions are required, and he knows the ocean did not provide such strongly basic conditions, so I don't know why he brings this one up at all. Beyond this, it is pointless to cite every extraneous reaction that was potentially happening at that time, as useless products were simply not selected by nature. Nature utilized the structures that were useful for information storage and metabolic activity.
Okay, so again, nature is doing selecting. Nature is choosing things. Useful for what? And let's not ignore the fact that, remember, the technique that's being used here, and it's used a lot, is to focus on this one thing, this one possible outcome from one particular type of result. Ignoring, as James Tour is trying to say, there's lots of things that need to be happening here in parallel, and you need an environment. So not just that this thing is happening, but it has to be happening within an environment. There has to be enough supply. There has to be enough input into the system to create to jumpstart to create another one. So he's making a huge assumption here, and I think he's cleverly slipping it through to your non-discriminatory mind. And it's because it sounds so simple and it sounds so reasonable that if it happened once, it could happen again and again and again. And what's so hard to believe about this? Why isn't this so hard? Why isn't this hard? Why isn't this more accepted? Why are you resisting this? This seems so simple and so elegant and so reasonable. If it happened once, it could happen 1,000 times. Uh, I just want to point that out. I'm not trying to make a point of anything other than to point out the technique that's being used here is to slip this in and make it sound very reasonable, make James Torr sound unreasonable, when James Torr is citing objections that are obvious to a common sense person that's not had their common sense drilled out of them by education. And that sounds anti-scientific and anti-intellectual. I think you need to look in the mirror because your intellectualism has made you anti-intellectual because it's removed the things that make sense in this world. So I appeal to tradition. Yes, I do. And I am making that clearly known that I'm appealing to the authority of common people. I'm appealing to common sense. So it's common. So if that is something that is you can't do, and we don't have the capacity to understand this, then you're going to have to force it upon us, perhaps. You're going to have to force this idea upon us, which governments seem to like to do, especially authoritarian type of governments, to educate people. It sounds familiar. Back in the 30s, some country tried that, and it was tried in Russia as well. Lots of bloodshed, lots of pain, lots of suffering for a particular outcome. I'm not claiming this person's doing that, but if you want people to believe a certain way and they won't do it naturally, they can only do it by force, and you do that by disqualifying them from access to society and food and pay, which is a possibility. If you don't align, then you can see that there's going to be some conflict coming, and it's already pretty much here from what you can see. So back to this point of nature being selective and saying this is useful, it's a lot like the biblical description of God in creation, saying he made animals, he made these types of things, and he said it was good. He favored those things because he created them. And it seems like they're trying to put that same type of characterization on nature, that nature is now the one saying this is good and this is useful, because nature must have something in mind, some end result in mind for this function and usefulness to fit. And that function is self-replication and survival of the fittest, survival of the strongest, and replication. That's a driving thing. I question, why does things feel the need to replicate? That's a why question, again, philosophical, not scientific. But it begs the question, what makes a protein know that it needs to replicate? Or if it did it randomly, how do you know that it could happen again if it's random? Oh, with enough time, with enough opportunity. Okay, one thing, let's say one thing works. Billions of years pass and one thing gets through, one protein sequence gets done. One. How many do we need for just one simple cell? So you can see how this idea doesn't scale. And it sounds simple when it's presented simply, but it doesn't scale. It cannot scale. It's impossible. I'm going to make those clear statements, and I'm going to expose my particular perspective, and I've said that at the outset. I'm just questioning the things that he wants to try to slip past our minds, because maybe he's being dishonest.
And ignored the rest. Dr. Torr very clearly demonstrates his inability to lecture on this topic when he talks like this. He is comparing the chemistry he is familiar with in his lab to what happened in the ocean billions of years ago, ignoring the stark differences in setting and principles involved. He is projecting his expertise in synthetic chemistry where it does not belong, as abiogenesis did not directly reflect modern lab synthesis. Nature had no specific plan like chemists do. There was an element of selection coupled with self-replication, and all of the structures he is referencing simply weren't the ones that were selected. That's all there is to it.
If you had 400 million years to get to a certain point in a synthesis of a particular class of compounds, now you'd run out of material. Anytime you do synthesis, you run out of material, even when you've optimized the yields, and you got to go back to the beginning. Well, say it took you 400 million years to get to a certain point on a synthesis. Now you have to go back and make more. But how do you go back and make more? Because nature never kept a laboratory notebook.
This is just perplexing. He acts like nature was given a few dozen molecules to play with, made some stuff, and then ran out of material, as though the ocean is a tiny reaction flask with a few milligrams of reactant. This is ridiculous. Molecules are mind-bogglingly abundant. There was no shortage of simple molecules to act as building blocks. The difficult part is explaining how they came together to form biological systems.
No, they actually, the difficult part is explaining how those molecules got there in the first place. You see, again, the cleverness and how deeply ingrained these ideas are built into their minds and their hearts from a young age, and how they've accepted this. And it's just part of the fiber that these things must have been this way. They have to have been this way, because they have to have been this way in order to get the things we have. It's this, they must have done this way idea. And what do you call that? That's dogmatic. You're being dogmatic when you're saying must. These things must have been, because this is how we have it, and there's no other way this could have it. It could happen. And all James Tour is trying to do is just say, look, you're making an assumption here that it takes you amount of time and you get this thing, and how does it replicate? How does it know what it did? There's no notebook, there's no intelligence to know that, yes, this is the path we took and this is what we got. Let's do that over and over again. And then where's the resources? We're assuming a lot of time, we're assuming lots of chance, and again, we're assuming almost unlimited resources, right? So let me know if I'm wrong. Let me know where I'm off track.
That there were enough molecules around to do it many times is not a problem whatsoever. Whatever processes came about, they were ongoing, and there were plenty of molecules in the ocean to perpetuate them. Nature doesn't need a laboratory notebook because natural processes are not directed. If conditions are such that a process may occur, it occurs. The chemistry does not need to be directed. It can be completely random until a self-perpetuating pattern of matter emerges by chance.
Miller and Urey.
A self-perpetuating pattern arises by chance. Why doesn't it continue to just be random? Why doesn't it just, if it appears, why does it need to keep appearing? Are there multiple billions and trillions of lightning strikes hitting the same pool, hitting the same source with all of these pre-existent molecules and amino acids? Again, I go to the base. I go to the root questions here. I go to the very core of the statements that they're making, and I question, how do they know these things? They're assuming them, and they're putting time and chance and unlimited resources on this altar and praying that it comes to life. It's no different than the pagans praying to the gods and the idols in the past and sacrificing so they could get a blessing and get the favor of the gods. The sacrifices here are time and chance and unlimited resources to get these things. And they all have to be aligned in such perfection, in such a way to produce over time what we have. But literally he's saying, if it happened, it happened. Well, wow, how does that? You mean it just happened? Well, it happened. It happened so it could happen. That's interesting. That sounds like hindsight engineering. We say 2020 engineering is hindsight of 2020, looking back and engineering things, and backfilling is a term I like to use. Like, oh, this is where we are, this is where we came from, so we're just going to fill in all the gaps with what? Time and chance.
Miller and Urey took some basic chemicals that are presumed on a prebiotic Earth, hydrogen cyanide, formaldehyde, and CO2, and they put those across a high voltage, simulating lightning. You can get some racemic amino acids out of those. But those racemic amino acids were racemic. Okay, that was in 1952. That was 2/3 of a century ago. What has happened in 2/3 of a century since Miller-Urey in other fields? Well, we've had human space flight. We have satellite connectivity. We have the internet. We have the entire silicon era of microchips, and we have computer technology. We have all of this. In the same 66 years, 2/3 of a century, we are still exactly where Miller and Urey were. We make a barrage of stereo-scrambled chemicals, nowhere close to even knowing how to make them and hook them together. They got to get hooked together in the proper order. We are clueless on this.
It's not surprising that Jim likes to talk about the Miller-Urey experiment, as it's a classic and a common talking point amongst creationists. This was an experiment in the 1950s that mimicked early Earth conditions and spontaneously produced small biomolecules like amino acids. Jim is correct that this experiment does not in any way demonstrate abiogenesis. All it does is produce the absolute smallest building blocks in living organisms. He is also correct to point out that the experiment produced a racemate of these molecules, not the homochiral mixture we want, or at least that would seem to be the most useful. And he is correct to imply that anyone who thinks referencing this singular experiment proves that abiogenesis is a done deal has absolutely no idea what they are talking about. But he then goes on to say, in this video and several others I've seen, that nothing has happened in the field since this experiment. This is totally absurd. Origin of life research is a thriving dynamic field. He must know this because he frequently boasts about reading all the papers in the field to try to understand what's going on. So the claim that there is nothing happening is perplexing and contradictory. There is plenty going on. He just doesn't understand it.
It's not just that issue that you don't see evidence for, but it's also molecules to man evolution or Darwinian evolution that you're skeptical of too. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I can qualify that a little bit because it depends on what we call Darwinian evolution. Even geneticists and biologists themselves are pulling away from Darwinian evolution.
Now, this is where we start to really see Jim show his true colors. For someone to be skeptical that abiogenesis occurred is mildly defensible, given that we don't know precisely how it happened. There are only two places where the god of the gaps can still find a place to stretch his legs, and those are the origin of the universe and the origin of life. There is no evidence that these events required the intervention of a deity, and we are learning more about them all the time. But at this precise moment, if you want to invoke a deity in either of those scenarios, it's not at all scientific, but knock yourself out. Here, however, we see that Jim also spouts anti-evolution rhetoric. This is not surprising, given his devotion to his religion and his interpretation of Scripture, which is probably not 100% literal, but isn't 0% either, as he is very vocal in his belief of the resurrection of Christ and potentially even myths like Adam and Eve. So when we jump over into biology, a field in which he truly has zero expertise, we see his opinions devolve into a firmly anti-science stance. He claims that biologists are pulling away from Darwinian evolution. That's complete nonsense. There is not a credible biologist on Earth that does not work within the framework of evolution by natural selection, other than a handful of fringe Christian apologists. He asks about the mechanisms by which evolution propagates, and how new body plans for organisms can arise, which is a totally reasonable question for an inquisitive person, though it does nothing but reveal that he is ignorant of basic principles of genetics. This stuff is not controversial. It can be found in any college biology textbook.
Okay, so you see Professor Dave is appealing to authority, the authority of biology textbooks, the authority of the scientific community. Again, not pointing out any type of real facts other than everybody else believes this, so it must be true. He doesn't think he's doing that because he's so infected with this idea that he has that you can't touch evolution, and he's completely off base because there are more and more books being written, more and more articles being written that Darwinian-based evolution ideas are almost comical now, based on the advances of science. That the assumptions that Darwin made, they're anecdotal at best. He's been disproven. The beaks of the birds, the moths, all these ideas he used for evolution displayed nothing about changing of a species or changing of a type. It's just the changes of a particular organism adapting to its environment. And he passed this off And it wasn't even him as being the original. I can't recall the person who predated him, but someone else wrote a book similar in idea, and his is the one that took off. But uh, I mentioned a book in another post I did. I think it's Matt Wolf. I think I called him Tom. No, it's Tom Wolf. Tom Wolf, The Kingdom of Speech, does a great job with describing how Darwinian-based evolutionary ideas are becoming less and less, becoming more and more indefensible is a good word, to where people are distancing themselves from that. Yes, it started things. It did start, but it can't hold up on the weight of the scientific discoveries. I am not an anti-scientist. I am an anti-evolutionist. But if you equate science with evolution, and evolution is sacred and can't be touched uh, because it's the source of life, it's your God, it's your religion, then you've not made, then evolution is no longer science. Science is the discovery by experimentation and a very structured process to come away with some ideas with math, with experimentation. Yes, you can make theories, you can make hypotheses, and you can try to prove them, uh, and with experiments. But in many cases, having to do with evolution, you can't go back in time, billions of years, and make the claims you do. You can point to certain things in geology and rock formations and structures and fossils, but you can make the same arguments for a biblical-based worldview of archaeology and geology, just as compelling. The only difference is the scientific scientific community is going to poo-poo it because it's the Bible, and that's it. That's all. They're not going to do it on facts. So, he's making these claims, and the same, but we can put the shoe on the other foot easily, and dismiss what he's trying to dismiss as well.
He just chooses not to read them. Or he throws out ridiculous straw men like how immune systems never turn into a digestive system or something idiotic like that. This is such an absurd thing to say that it borders on Hovindian.
I don't understand evolution, and I will confess that to you. Is it okay for me to say that I don't understand this? Is that all right?
Yes, Jim, it is okay for you to say that. You don't have to understand any aspect of biology, nor should you be expected to, since you never studied it. You're a chemist, one that specifically works on molecular machines which have absolutely nothing to do with biological life. So just leave it at that. You don't understand evolution. Most people don't understand what you do either, but that doesn't mean that what you do isn't real. Go and make your impressive molecules, and stop pretending that evolution doesn't work just because you don't understand it.
I have no idea who's going to hell. I can tell you for sure, based on my understanding of the scriptures, who's going to heaven. Believing that Jesus is Lord and confessing that and believing in the physical resurrection of the dead. I have no idea who's not going, but I believe in a God who knows.
This is all you need to hear to understand people like Dr. Tor. Whatever it is that tethers them to their religious belief, this supersedes their capacity to use logic and reason. When their work does not conflict with their religion, there is no problem. But when faced with a concept that contradicts their interpretation of Scripture, their mental faculties are no longer reliable. Fear of mortality, a desire to go to heaven and live eternally, these are fundamental, instinctual driving forces that can overpower the psyche of even brilliant rational scientists. It is painfully obvious that topics like evolution and abiogenesis make Jim uncomfortable because it forces him to reconsider the tenets of his faith. His discomfort when discussing these topics is palpable, given his loud, aggressive manner of speech, where he becomes indistinguishable from a preacher.
You're as clueless as I am, as everybody else, on how life formed, okay?
I agree.
Say it. This
Yes,
is
I
the
am. I agree.
problem. No
Absolutely.
scientists want to go out there and say it. That's the problem. We are clueless on this. That's the problem. And they go out there pontificating as if they know. That's the problem. And then they corrupt a whole generation after generation after generation.
The conflict of interest should now be quite clear. Despite his insistence to the contrary, Jim's religious views are informing his scientific stance rather than the other way around.
So you can see how we could put the shoe on the other foot here again as well. he's accusing Jim Tour of inability to use logic and reason, and uncomfortable at faced with challenges to the tenets of his faith. And why can't we say the same thing of Professor Dave here? His assumptions and his tenets, when they're being challenged, he certainly gets upset, and he certainly makes fun. He certainly calls people names, idiots, he said, uneducated, lack of capacity, dishonest. So what does that sound like? Do you have to yell to be offensive, or can you be quietly offensive as he is being? So you can't. Everybody's biases informs the way that they see things, their worldview, what their premise is, what they start off at. If you start off that there can be no God, that is a bias. That's going to change the way you perceive things. You look at a cell and you'll say, oh, how did this come about? It must have taken billions of years and all these things. So you can't distance yourself from your own biases and your own bigotry. So to take issue with Jim Tour's convictions and his faith is disingenuous at best. Why don't we just stick to the facts? Why don't we stick to the things that can be measured? And I love science. I love how it can discover things. And microbiology and the things that see how the cells are and the components and the workings of a cell and the proteins that come together and have to have perfectness to function as a molecular machine are fascinating. And I think I applaud science. I want them to find more and more things, because I know that they will eventually see the face of God, the thumbprints of God in these things, if they're honest. But if they're dogmatic and they're going to double, triple, and quadruple down on what they believe in spite of evidence to the contrary, then they're just as dogmatic and preacher-like as he's accusing Jim Tour of. And all I'm trying to do is equate what atheists commonly do about Bible believers and creationists, at least put us in the same level, and say whatever you say of us can easily be said of you as well. And it's all about perspective. And to fool yourself and say it's science that's informing me, and ignore the fact that you have a bias, and ignore the fact that you have a predisposition, or that you were pre-programmed to believe these things by years of education, or you just dismiss God entirely on your own, that those things are going to influence the way you believe things and see things. These worldview issues are at the heart of everything. No one can distance themselves from their own bias.
He is similar to Kurt Wise, who is regularly cited by creationists as a PhD geologist that believes in a young Earth. Less important is the fact that Kurt's PhD is in paleontology and not geology, but more important is the fact that he has stated outright that his belief in a young Earth is based not on scientific evidence whatsoever, but rather on biblical scripture. He admits that there is no evidence that could ever cause him to change his mind, because scripture is more valuable to him than empirical evidence. So people who pretend his opinion on the age of the Earth is worth more than any uneducated person is misled, because he is using none of his education to arrive at his belief. He instead allows his religion to overpower empiricism. His views on this issue are therefore not scientific, and his opinion should not be treated as scientific expertise. Dr. Tour differs in that he does not outwardly state that scripture supersedes empiricism, but it is quite apparent that this is what is happening in his mind regardless. He just won't admit it, probably not even to himself. His contribution to synthetic organic chemistry, where the subject of his work has no interface with scripture, is considerable. His stance on abiogenesis, which does encroach on scripture, is not particularly scientific and therefore not relevant. The irony is that Jim's unwavering faith forces him to believe in an inferior God. If one is to believe in a God that created everything, there are two options. There is an omniscient, omnipotent God that triggered the emergence of our universe from an initial singularity with all of the precise constants that would lead to the formation of stars and galaxies, planetary systems, complex chemistry, and eventually life. Then there is Jim's God, one who created a universe with a vague plan, one that was able to bring simple molecules into existence, but then finding that not much was happening, had to step in a second time to figure out how to make enantiomerically pure building blocks, physically nudge them together to polymerize, and then decide what magic powder to sprinkle in there to make it alive. I don't know about you, but if I was a religious person, the first God seems a lot more worthy of worship.
Interesting admission there, because that's actually the God of the Bible. I'm not sure where he got the God that he thinks Jim Tour worships. I know that Jim Tour worships Christ, the one who says all things are created by him and through him and to him are all things in him consist. Not everything is made by him, and nothing was made that wasn't made by him. So I don't know where he got the idea that Jim Tour's God requires this nudging. That's more of the people who put together evolution and creation together, which is a middle position which no one can defend. And I think it is a losing. There's no way that can be defended. The God number one, numerically number one as well, is the God of the Bible, the creator of everything as is. And I think the only issue that he's trying to communicate here is, well, there's obviously evidence of creatures that don't exist anymore. The word escapes me, extinct. And there's evidence of plants that maybe not exist anymore. And he's going to probably contrive that into thinking that, well, God wasn't perfect in his creation and blah, blah, blah from all of that. So I think he's making something out of nothing here. I don't know where he got the idea of God number two. Maybe something Jim Tour said on somewhere else. From what I've read and heard of Jim Tour, I haven't heard him express that. So not sure where that's going, but obviously he's close to believing the truth in the God number one. And that's interesting that he would state that.
So that covers Dr. Tour. Now let's talk a bit about what far less educated people do with precisely the same agenda on this topic. The first talking point I hear constantly is some variation on the probability of a protein forming spontaneously, and they always assign some seemingly arbitrary number they found somewhere, like 1 in 10 to the 120th power, or something ridiculous. People who put forward this kind of talking point are always confused as to whether they are talking about a mechanism by which proteins can form spontaneously in general, or whether they are talking about the probability of a protein with a specific amino acid sequence forming. To clarify, proteins are polymers made of amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids, and these undergo dehydration reactions to link together and form long chains, which we call polypeptides. And in living organisms, polypeptides are called proteins. There are different ways this polymerization can take place, both in biological systems and the laboratory. None of these methods were available before life existed, so we must try to understand how it happened initially. And we will elucidate this a bit later. But putting a quantitative probability on such a process arising is totally ridiculous. So what most people mean when they say this is that it is highly improbable that a specific protein with a specific amino acid sequence will form, so as to produce a protein capable of carrying out some specific biological function. Here, the number is easy to calculate. Each amino acid residue is 1 out of 20, so we just raise 20 to the power of how many amino acids there are in the chain. Even considering a small protein of 100 residues, we can see how big this number gets. But the problem is that this manner of discussing probabilities is very misleading. Nature did not set out to generate a particular amino acid sequence. The process was completely random. Countless different sequences were generated. It was only when a protein ended up having some particular function by chance that its production was preferred statistically, and it began to propagate with greater frequency than other sequences. Furthermore, its functionality began as approximate and was refined over many cycles of optimization, ending up as the astoundingly efficient enzymes we see today, billions of years later. So a discussion of the probability of a particular sequence forming is utterly meaningless. Here's an analogy that should help drive this point home. Let's say 10 people are having a get-together and they are curious as to what everyone's birthday is. They go down the line. One person says June 13th, another says November 21st, and so forth. Each of them have a 1 in 365 chance of having that particular birthday. So what is the probability that those 10 people in that room would have those 10 birthdays? Well, it's 1 in 365 to the 10th power, or 1 in 4.2 times 10 to the 25, which is 42 trillion. The odds are unthinkable, and yet there they are, sitting in that room. So how can this be? Well, everyone has to have a birthday. Those people have those birthdays. What are the odds that they would have those specific birthdays? Very, very low. What are the odds that they would have some birthdays? 100%. Likewise, every protein has an amino acid sequence. When proteins first began to form, the sequences were random. What are the odds that they would have a particular amino acid sequence? Very, very low. What are the odds that they would have some amino acid sequence? 100%. That's all there is to it. So
All right, so he's trying to really oversimplify something, and there's a lot of assumptions that go into this. It sounds reasonable. Like eventually, if you have, let's take this, reduce it down to the most simple and most ridiculous example. You have 3 socks, and you want to that are white or black, and you want to make sure that you have a drawer full of socks, let's just say, white and black, and you're blind and you don't know which one's which. Your chances of pulling out a pair, 100% chance of pulling out a pair, you'd have to pull out 3, because you only have 2 choices. And if you pulled out only 2, you might get a white and a black, but if you pulled out 3, you're certain to get at least a pair. You're not out there trying to find black because you're blind, or white. So if your choice was to go, now I want to make sure I got 2 white socks, you would have to pull a lot more socks to ensure that you'll have white, and you'd have to be able to know that they're white. So if you go into a room that's dark and you reach into a sock drawer that has mixed white and dark socks, 50 of one and 50 of the other, you'll pull out 3 and you'll certainly have 1 pair of either one. If you want to pull out a pair of white for sure, you'd have to pull a lot more. I'm not going to go into that number. You can figure it out. Those are puzzles you can find online. But he's basically saying that it could happen, therefore it will eventually happen. But let's think about this. The resources have to be unlimited. The time has to be unlimited. And the cycle that produces this protein and this sequence has to repeat over and over and over again, infinitely practically. Yes, it eventually gets that sequence. But where is the thing that says stop? That's a good sequence. Repeat that sequence over and over again. Oh, it happens because it happened. It happens because it happened. Time and chance. We cannot ignore this incredible amount of weight. All the weight of these arguments are riding on those 2 things. Oh, I'm sorry. Time, chance, and unlimited resources. So those assumptions built in, you see how cleverly that bypassed a thinking mind and a discriminating mind. And he thinks he's getting away with it, but we're not letting him.
So this attempt at a quantitative analysis of probabilities is completely misleading, and people who put this argument forward have no understanding of biosynthesis or, honestly, of probability in general. The second talking point I hear a lot is that the spontaneous formation of life violates the second law of thermodynamics. This is ridiculous, and people who say this have no idea what this law states. They think that the law forbids order from arising spontaneously. In actuality, it doesn't say anything of the sort, and in fact, order arises spontaneously all the time in ways we experience every day. When water freezes to form ice, the molecules go from a disordered state, moving around at random, to a highly ordered lattice structure with a specific geometry repeating in every direction. This order is seen even more prominently with something like a snowflake, which displays order and symmetry to such an incredible degree so as to be strikingly beautiful. And yet, these form spontaneously. This is also how soap works. Soap molecules are amphiphilic, meaning that one side interacts well with water and the other does not. They have polar heads with a formal negative charge that makes electrostatic interactions with polar water molecules, and they have nonpolar tails, which are unable to make such interactions. Thus, in water, soap molecules spontaneously form spherical structures called micelles, where all the polar heads orient themselves outwards and all the nonpolar tails hide away towards the inside, as this maximizes the number of interactions soap molecules can make with water, so as to bring the system to a lower energy. All the dirt and grime on your hands, which is nonpolar and doesn't wash away with water alone, suddenly gets trapped inside the micelles, since that's the nonpolar region, and the micelle is water-soluble as a whole, so the dirt gets washed away. The spontaneous formation of ordered structures is literally how soap works.
So if soap arose in nature spontaneously by itself, you could see that this is a good argument. But soap is manufactured. Soap was engineered. Someone designed soap and knew what they were doing and created something to accomplish what they were looking for. To say it's spontaneous, again, disingenuous and trying to slip something by in an example that sounds so simple and so elegant. And about the water, water is a mature structure. It is what it is. It has a nature of itself, and when it freezes, it does do that. So to claim that that's random, I don't know how you make that argument. I don't know how you use that example when it clearly has a structure. And random to me you wouldn't know what shape water would do when it froze. Why would there be an ordered lattice? So randomness produces order. So I guess that's his point. Is we see randomness producing order all the time. What do you consider randomness? I guess is the question. So if you're saying soap is random, creates these micelles to trap waste and trap dirt, well, that's not random. It was created. Someone designed it, and some chemical engineer came up with the idea that created what you describe as random. So maybe I'm missing something here. Maybe he knows something about soap I don't. It was an accident, maybe somebody accidentally figured it out. But again, it goes back to the resources. Where do these things come from? And how do they know to connect together? I mean, it's interesting that all these little individual components, water, lattices, and these micelles seem to know what to do. There's some intelligence built into them that's interesting, and they create a function that's useful to humans. Random.
So what does the second law of thermodynamics actually say? Well, I have a physics tutorial that goes into quite a bit of detail if you're interested. But in short, it says that for any spontaneous process, the entropy of the universe must increase, where entropy is a word that refers to the dispersal of matter and energy. Notice that it says the entropy of the universe and not of a system. A system can produce a local decrease in entropy, but in doing so, the entropy of the universe must increase. So, when water molecules form ice, or when soap molecules form micelles, they are adopting the ordered geometry that maximizes the electrostatic interactions being made, which releases as much energy as possible. Local order is generated, but energy is released, so overall there is increased dispersal of energy, and the entropy of the universe increases. The same thing is true of virtually every spontaneous process in the body. When an enzyme anneals to a DNA strand ready to carry out some function, it does so because of electrostatic interactions between the active site of the enzyme and that sequence of DNA, and in displacing water molecules that were in that location, previously making similar contacts, these water molecules are liberated to bulk solvent, and there is a dispersal of matter. Entropy increases. So if you ever hear anyone misrepresenting the second law of thermodynamics or the concept of entropy in general, you now know how to correct them. So those are two quick talking points I wanted to throw in just because I get them all the time from science deniers, even though they have nothing to do with Dr. Tour, who would never use them. Now let's wrap things up with an exceptionally brief overview of where we are at with origin of life research. What do we know about how this happened? Well, we can start with small molecules. Everything before that is astrophysics. If you want to learn about how hydrogen collected to form stars, which then fused all the elements in the universe, and then the subsequent formation of planetary systems after enough stars went supernova, check out my astronomy playlist. Otherwise, we can take for granted that lots of small molecules existed on Earth shortly after its formation. The first step from here is to get small biomolecules like amino acids and nucleotides. As we alluded to earlier, the Miller-Urey experiment in the 1950s demonstrated this to be no problem. Given exceptionally simple molecules like methane, ammonia, water, and an electric spark to simulate lightning, amino acids are shown to form quite rapidly. Detractors will commonly claim that the experiment produced only 2 amino acids, but this is a lie. Initially, 5 were shown, but later examinations of residue on the original apparatus with better technology than was available in the 50s show that 23 amino acids were made, along with other important classes of biomolecules. Nucleotides form from simple molecules like formamide, and we have even seen spectroscopic evidence of these and other biomolecules existing in space, which offers the possibility of them arriving on Earth already made, a version of the so-called panspermia hypothesis. So getting the smallest building blocks of life is absolutely no problem. Next, we need polymerization. DNA, proteins, polysaccharides.
I'm sorry, absolutely no problem. Really? Okay. All right. I'm just absolutely no problem. Yeah, no problem. Just these things formed and it just happened and they just happened because they did. No problem. Easy.
Saccharides, these are all polymers, so some mechanism must have arisen to join the small bits together. This likely happened first with ribonucleotides, as these have been demonstrated to polymerize on hot clay to produce RNA. Even just with the formation of RNA, the possibilities become significant. Ribozymes are RNA molecules with catalytic function. This means that beyond merely serving as genetic material, they can catalyze chemical reactions, including the production of other molecules such as proteins. And in fact, our own ribosomes are ribozymes which perform precisely this function. Ribozymes can even perform self-replication. That's right, already at this simple level, we are introducing the possibility of self-replication. In this case, via autocatalysis, thereby introducing the possibility of a form of natural selection, whereby chance alterations in molecular structure that raise the statistical likelihood of the proliferation of the molecule will cause that molecule to propagate with greater frequency. The widely accepted RNA world hypothesis postulates that RNA molecules performed all manner of catalytic activity, and that proteins only later took over this functionality, which they were able to perform with more versatility, and this was a major step towards the origin of life. With regards to protein production, if catalysis via ribozymes is deemed insufficient, there are plenty of other possibilities. Hydrothermal vents or volcanic hot springs could have provided the energy required for the polymerization reactions, but my personal favorite explanation involves heterogeneous catalysis over mineral-rich surfaces in tidal pools. The small volume of the pools solves the problem of molecules having to find each other in the ocean, acting essentially like a chemist's flask in a laboratory. But more importantly, the mineral surfaces could have acted as naturally occurring organometallic catalysts. These surfaces may have not only performed efficient syntheses, but given the possibility of the surfaces exhibiting chirality, it could have been the case that they preferentially reacted with one particular enantiomeric version of molecules, like perhaps only L amino acids. This would readily explain their prevalence in proteins, with enzymes arising later to perpetuate this stereochemical bias after their dominance had already been set into place. Even without this stereospecificity in polymerization, there are other ways to get enantiomeric excess with the amino acids themselves. It has been demonstrated that recrystallization of a mixture of amino acid racemates with a slight excess of asparagine caused amino acids with the same configuration to preferentially co-crystallize. You get a solid containing only one enantiomer and a supernatant primarily of the other. All that's left is some natural filtration mechanism to separate the two and the emergence of autocatalysis in one. This is one way that a slight asymmetry can be dramatically magnified. So we can see that the chirality of biomolecules may have been implemented at any number of places throughout the process of abiogenesis. From here, biopolymers need to assemble into some kind of rudimentary organized structure. This is nowhere near as far-fetched as science deniers make it out to be. First, the system needs a boundary. Luckily, amphiphilic lipids spontaneously form ordered structures. As we mentioned earlier, this is how soap works. So this is the least mystifying aspect of abiogenesis. Bilayer formation is a spontaneous process due to the amphiphilic nature of phospholipids, although in prebiotic absence of phospholipids, the first membranes can have been bilayers or even monolayers of fatty acids or other simple lipids that can easily have arisen spontaneously. Lots of research has also been done involving proteinoids, which can generate microspheres, something of a precursor to real cells. So we can begin to imagine bilayers forming around a collection of biomolecules, including RNA and proteins. This allowed for the emergence of hypercycles, which are organizations of self-replicating macromolecules connected.
So I got to wrap this up. But I think you get the idea, and if you want to continue to watch that, the URL's at the top. I'll post it in this video. Thank you for listening.